The four-star general didn't walk into Hartwell Regional Medical Center to meet the chief of surgery. He didn't come for the board of directors. He didn't come for a ribbon cutting or a press photo or any of the carefully staged moments that hospital administrators love to arrange when important people show up. He came for the woman standing at the exit doors with a cardboard box under her arm. She had been fired 11 minutes ago. The lobby was still buzzing with the news. Scrub nurse terminated for negligence, surgical error, reckless conduct. When the convoy pulled up outside, 3 black vehicles, government plates, and a man in full dress uniform who walked past every administrator in the building like they were furniture. He stopped in front of her, and he saluted. Before we go further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button and follow along because this channel is where stories like this live. Stories that will shake you, shock you, and remind you that the most extraordinary people are almost always the ones nobody sees coming. Drop a like on this video and tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching from? I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The morning started the way most mornings did at Hartwell Regional Medical Center, badly. The overnight staff was already 20 minutes behind by the time the day shift filtered in through the side entrance off Meridian Avenue, badges swiping, sneakers squeaking on floors that the cleaning crew had mopped too wet, the smell of burnt coffee drifting out of the break room on the 3rd floor like a small apology for what the next 12 hours were going to look like. Nora Reeves arrived at 6:47 a.m. She didn't come through the main entrance. She never did. The main entrance was for visitors who needed the warmth of automatic doors and the gentle sound of a water feature someone had installed in the atrium 3 years ago to make the place feel less like a hospital. Nora had no use for any of that. She came in through the loading dock, same as always, nodding to the supply guys unloading a pallet of IV bags, cutting through the service corridor, and pushing through the double doors into the sterile prep hall without breaking stride. She was 29 years old, 5'6", brown hair pulled back in a tight braid that she'd done in the car because she'd overslept by 14 minutes after a shift that had run to nearly midnight the night before. She looked tired. She was tired. But she moved through that corridor with the kind of controlled efficiency that had nothing to do with energy and everything to do with habit. The deep, bone-level habit of a person who had learned a long time ago that you show up, you do the work, and you keep your mouth shut about everything in between. Her locker was in Bay 4, scrub room annex, 3rd shelf from the top. She had exactly enough time to change, check the board, and be standing at her assigned OR station before the first case was wheeled in at 7:15. The board outside the scrub room listed her assignment, OR 3. Attending surgeon, Dr. Callum Draper. She stopped when she read that, just for a second. Then she exhaled through her nose and kept moving. Callum Draper was not the worst surgeon at Hartwell Regional. He was, however, the most dangerous kind of difficult, the kind who was genuinely skilled enough that his worst qualities had never been forced to catch up with him. He was 51 years old, cardiothoracic specialty, the kind of surgeon whose reputation had been built across 2 decades of genuinely hard cases and successful outcomes. He had the awards on his office wall and the deference of the residents who trailed him on rounds, and the particular confidence of a man who had been told he was exceptional for so long that he'd stopped being able to hear anything else. Nora had worked with him 4 times in the past year. 3 of those times had been fine. The 4th time, 6 weeks ago, he'd thrown a clamp across the room because the instrument count had run slow, and Nora had been the one standing closest to where it landed. She hadn't reported it. She'd picked up the clamp and kept working. That was the kind of thing you learned to do when you were new to a place, and the person throwing things had his name on a wing of the hospital. She finished changing, clipped her badge to her chest, and walked out to meet the day. Check. The patient was a 63-year-old named Harold Foss, referred from a satellite clinic in Greensboro with a thoracic aortic aneurysm that had been growing quietly for 2 years before it decided to become someone's problem. He'd been in the system for 6 days, worked up, cleared for surgery, and was now lying on a gurney in pre-op with the look of a man who had run out of things to say about his situation. His wife was in the waiting room. His son had driven up from Columbia the night before. Nora checked the instrument tray herself. She always did. Not because she didn't trust the processing staff, most of them were meticulous, But because once those doors closed and the case was live, there was no version of someone else set it up that made anything better. You were the scrub nurse. The tray was your problem. Everything was there. Everything was where it needed to be. She did the count with the circulating nurse, Patrice Odom, who had been at Hartwell for 11 years and ran her counts the way a tax auditor runs numbers, twice, with commentary. They finished the sponge count, instrument count, and Sharp's count 12 minutes before the patient was brought in. "Draper's in a mood," Patrice said, without looking up from the board. "What kind?" "The kind where he didn't sleep." Nora didn't respond to that. There was nothing useful to say about it. Dr. Draper came in at 7:11, already gloved, already gowned, already carrying that low electrical tension that meant something had gone wrong before the day started, and he was going to let the OR absorb the cost of it. He barely looked at the room when he entered. His resident, a third-year named doctor, Solis followed 2 steps behind with the careful posture of someone who'd learned not to get too close. "Let's go," Draper said. The patient came in. The case started. Ticked. For the first 40 minutes, it was textbook. Draper was, and this was the frustrating truth of it, extraordinary when he was focused. His hands moved with a precision that was almost impersonal, like watching a machine that had been tuned to a very high standard. The aneurysm repair required isolating a section of the descending aorta, clamping it, resecting the damaged segment, and grafting in a synthetic replacement. And Draper did the early dissection with the kind of quiet efficiency that made even the hard parts look straightforward. Nora worked the tray. She anticipated instrument requests before they were made, held suction at the right angle without being asked, kept her eyes on the field. This was the part of the job she was good at. The wordless choreography of a surgical team in rhythm, everyone moving in their lane, the room reduced to the single focused problem of keeping Harold Foss alive. Then, at the 47-minute mark, the pressure alarm went off. It was the perfusion monitor, the device tracking arterial line pressure during the bypass phase. The number spiked, dropped, spiked again. Dr. Solis called it out immediately. The anesthesiologist, Dr. Kim Whitfield, was already adjusting. "Arterial lines showing artifact," Whitfield said, "could be positional. Or it could be real," Draper said without looking up. "Get me a pressure reading from the radial." Nora was already reaching for the next instrument in the anticipated sequence when the table-mounted retractor shifted. It was one of the self-retaining units, a Bookwalter-style system they'd positioned 20 minutes into the case, and the arm had been tracking toward the edge of its stable range for the last 10 minutes. She'd noticed it drifting, had intended to flag it when there was a natural pause in the rhythm. There hadn't been one. The retractor arm slipped. It didn't fall. The base caught it, but the blade shifted position, pulling slightly on the retracted tissue. The field moved. Draper's hand moved with it, reflexively, and his dissection plane deviated by a fraction of an inch before he corrected. A fraction of an inch in a thoracic aortic repair is not nothing. "What was that?" His voice went flat and cold. "Retractor shifted," Nora said. "I'll resecure it." "You'll resecure it." He repeated her words the way people do when they want the room to hear how insufficient those words are. "You're telling me that retractor just moved on an open aortic repair, and your response is, you'll resecure it." "I'm securing it now." She had already repositioned the arm, locked the joint, checked the blade angle. 15 seconds, maybe 20, from the moment it happened to the moment it was stable. "That instrument was in your control," Draper said. "That is a scrub nurse's responsibility." Nora didn't answer. The field was what mattered right now. She was watching the field. "Look at me when I'm speaking to you." She looked at him. "The retractor is secured. Dr. Whitfield, do you have a stable pressure reading?" Whitfield, who had the particular gift of ignoring interpersonal fires while managing physiological ones, replied without inflection. "Radial line reads 112/70. She's stable." Draper stared at Nora for another 2 seconds. Then he went back to the field. The case continued. They closed at 9:48. Harold Foss was moved to the CVU-ICU in stable condition with vitals that Whitfield described, to no one in particular, as better than reasonable. Nobody said anything else in the OR. The debrief was silence and the sound of instrument counts and the rustle of drapes being stripped from the table. Nora broke down her tray, handed off the instruments to processing, and was writing her nursing notes at the charting station outside OR3 when Patrice appeared at her elbow. "Draper's already in the charge nurse's office." Nora kept writing. "Okay." "He's asking for a formal incident review." She stopped writing. Not because it surprised her, because the specific weight of it, the formal language, the institutional machinery that those words implied, landed differently than she'd expected. She set the pen down and looked at the wall for a moment. "On what grounds?" "Equipment negligence. He's saying the retractor displacement was a setup error." Nora thought about the prep she'd done that morning, the checks she'd run on every instrument, the count she'd done with Patrice, the way she'd watched that retractor arm for the better part of an hour, and had made a judgment call about timing. That in retrospect, she should have overridden 3 minutes earlier. That was the honest part of it. She should have flagged it earlier. She hadn't. She'd been watching the field and managing the rhythm and calculating the window for intervention, and she'd been wrong about the window. She wasn't going to pretend otherwise, but she also knew exactly what was happening in that office right now, and it had nothing to do with accurate accounting. She stood up, straightened her scrubs, and went to the charge nurse's station to wait. Sandra Keogh had been the OR charge nurse at Hartwell Regional for 9 years. She was 54, practical, and deeply worn down by the particular exhaustion of being the human buffer between surgeons who wielded power and nursing staff who bore the consequences of how that power was used. She was not a cruel person. She was not even, most of the time, an unfair one. But she operated inside a structure where Callum Draper's surgical volume generated enough revenue to fund most of the department's quarterly budget, and that fact had a gravitational pull on every decision made in her vicinity. She called Nora in at 10:22. Draper was seated in the chair to the left of Sandra's desk. He hadn't changed out of his scrubs. He had the look of a man who had already decided what this meeting was and was waiting for it to confirm his decision. "Sit down, Nora," Sandra said. Nora sat. "Dr. Draper has filed a formal complaint regarding the incident during Mr. Foss's case this morning, specifically regarding the retractor displacement and the potential impact on the surgical field during a critical phase of the procedure." "I understand." He's characterizing it as an equipment preparation failure. "The retractor was correctly positioned and secured at the start of the case," Nora said. "It drifted during the procedure. I identified the drift and resecured it." "After it had already moved?" Draper said. "Yes." "During an open aortic repair." "The patient is stable. Dr. Whitfield confirmed hemodynamic stability throughout." "That is not the point." Draper's voice had the particular quality of restrained volume that is somehow louder than shouting. "The point is that an instrument in your care caused an uncontrolled movement in my surgical field. The point is that I have been practicing cardiothoracic surgery for 22 years, and I have never had a retractor shift on me during a live aortic repair. The point is that you had one job in that room." "I had 17 jobs in that room," Nora said. Silence. Draper looked at her like she'd said something in a language he didn't recognize. "Excuse me?" "I had 17 concurrent responsibilities in that OR, the same as every other scrub nurse on this floor. I managed all of them, including resecuring a piece of equipment that drifted during a 2-hour procedure because that is what happens with self-retaining retractors over extended cases. I'm not dismissing the seriousness of the moment. I'm saying that characterizing this as a preparation failure is not accurate." The room was very quiet. Sandra Keogh was looking at the desk. Draper sat back in his chair. When he spoke again, his voice had gone smooth in a way that was worse than the restrained volume. "Sandra," he said, "I think you and I both know what needs to happen here." Sandra Keogh did not look at Nora. That, more than anything, told Nora what was coming. "I'm going to need to place you on administrative suspension pending a full review," Sandra said. "Effective this morning." "A review based on what documentation?" Nora asked. "Based on the complaint filed by the attending, which has not been substantiated by the incident record, the patient outcome, or the circulating nurse's account." "Nora," Sandra's voice had gone very careful, "I need you to let the process work." "The process." She said it flatly, not as a challenge, as a thing she was testing the weight of. "Please go home for now. We'll be in touch within 48 hours. Nora stood up. She looked at Callum Draper, who was looking at the window. She looked at Sandra Keough, who was still looking at the desk. She walked out. She was back in her locker bay at 10:31, pulling her street clothes from the shelf, moving on the same controlled autopilot that had gotten her through the OR that morning and through 6 years of situations before this one that had required the same thing. The discipline of not letting what you felt interfere with what you needed to do next. Patrice found her there. "I heard," Patrice said. "It's fine." "It's not fine." Nora folded her civilian jacket over her arm. "Did you log the retractor position in your circulating notes?" "Yes. I noted it was repositioned intraoperatively without field compromise." "Good. Keep that. Don't let anyone tell you to revise it." She pulled her bag from the locker. "If they call you in for the review, tell them exactly what you saw." "Nora, you should fight this." "I know. So why aren't you—" "I'm going to," she said. "I'm just not going to do it today. In that office. In front of him." She zipped the bag. "Some fights you don't win by throwing punches in the room. You win them by staying clean until the moment is right." Patrice looked at her for a long moment. "There's something about you," she said. "I've thought this since the first week you were here. There is something about you that doesn't fit." Nora picked up her bag. "I'll see you when this is resolved." She walked out of the locker bay, down the service corridor, and toward the main lobby. The suspension notice caught up to her at 11:14, delivered electronically to her hospital email while she was still in the building, which meant that Sandra had sent it the moment she left the office and had not, as suggested, waited for any process whatsoever. The subject line read, "Suspension of clinical privileges, pending investigation." The body of the email informed her that her badge access had been deactivated effective immediately and that she should surrender any hospital property before leaving the premises. Her badge, which she needed to get through the door she was currently standing in front of. She stood there for a moment, looking at the door. Then she turned around, walked back to the security desk, handed the badge to the guard, a young man named Terrence, who had the look of someone who genuinely wished he was anywhere else right now, and said, "Can you let me out through the main lobby?" "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly. She walked through the main lobby, past the atrium with its water feature, past the gift shop and the information desk, and the clusters of visitors who were having the worst days of their lives in the waiting areas off the main corridor. She walked through it all, and she did not look at any of it, and she did not let any of it touch her face. She was 10 feet from the exit when she heard the sound from outside. It was a specific sound, not loud, not dramatic, just the particular quality of multiple vehicle doors opening and closing in sequence. She'd heard it before, in places that were very different from this lobby. She stopped. Through the glass doors, she could see 3 vehicles pulled up to the curb, black government plate SUVs, and figures in uniform moving toward the entrance. She had no reason to think any of it had anything to do with her. She had every reason to know that it did. The doors slid open. The man who walked through them first was wearing the dress uniform of a United States Army general, 4 stars on his shoulder, chest covered in ribbons that told a story most people in this lobby would never be able to read. He was 62 years old, built like someone who had never stopped doing the work, and he moved through the atrium the way people move when they are completely certain about where they're going. He was looking directly at her. Nora Reeves stood very still. Behind her, she could feel the lobby beginning to register what was happening. The rustle of attention, the shift in ambient noise, people turning to look at the man in the uniform, and then following his line of sight back to the woman with the bag over her shoulder standing near the door. The general walked toward her and stopped 3 feet away. He came to attention. And then, in front of the gift shop and the information desk, and Terrence at the security station, and Sandra Keough, who had just appeared at the top of the escalator, and every visitor and staff member and orderly in the lobby of Hartwell Regional Medical Center, Brigadier General Warren Alcott raised his right hand to the brim of his cover in a formal military salute. The lobby went completely silent. Nora didn't move for a full 3 seconds. Then, slowly, she set her bag down on the floor. And she returned it. The salute lasted 4 seconds. That was long enough for the lobby to go from confused silence to something else entirely. The particular breathless quality of a room full of people who have just watched something they don't have language for yet. The water feature in the atrium kept running. The PA system paged someone to radiology in a flat, automated voice. Everything else had stopped. Nora dropped her hand first. The general dropped his a half-second later, the way military protocol required. The junior party initiates, the senior follows. And the fact that he had done it the right way, the correct way, meant that he knew exactly who she was and exactly what rank that salute was acknowledging, which meant this was not an accident and it was not a courtesy visit, and none of what was about to happen was going to be containable. Warren Alcott looked at her for a moment with the direct, assessing calm of a man who had spent 40 years making decisions in bad situations. "Sergeant Reeves," he said. The name landed in the lobby like a stone into still water. Not her hospital name, not her civilian name, her rank and her name, used together in the particular way that only people who had known her in a very specific context would ever use them. "Sir," she said, "I need a few minutes of your time. I was just leaving." "I know." He said it without apology. "I'm asking anyway." She looked at him for a moment, then reached down and picked up her bag from the floor. "Not here," she said. He nodded once, as if he'd expected exactly that, and gestured toward the corridor to the left of the lobby where a conference room sat unused on Tuesday mornings. One of his aides, a young captain who had been standing at parade rest near the door, moved ahead of them to check that it was empty. It was. Nora walked in. The general followed. The aide closed the door from the outside. She set her bag on one of the chairs and stood with her arms at her sides and waited, because she had learned a long time ago that when a general came to find you, you let him talk first. "You're harder to find than you should be," Alcott said. That was the idea. "I know it was." He wasn't sitting down. Neither was she. "We've been looking for you for 8 months. I wasn't lost?" "No, you weren't." He set his cover on the table and ran a hand over his close-cropped hair. "How long have you been here?" 14 months. As a scrub nurse? "Yes." He looked at her the way people look at something that doesn't quite resolve into sense. Not with contempt, with something more like the specific confusion of a man who had spent a career matching capability to role and was looking at the most extreme example he'd ever encountered of those two things being completely misaligned. "I heard what happened this morning," he said. She didn't ask how. There were people in buildings everywhere who made it their business to know things, and Warren Alcott had more of those people around him than most. "It's being handled," she said. "It doesn't look like it's being handled." "Sir, with respect, why are you here?" He was quiet for a moment. Not hesitating, she thought. Deciding how much of it to say in this room, in this building, before the situation had been properly structured. "There's a situation developing," he said finally. "One that has your particular skill set written all over it. I'm not going to lay it out in a hospital conference room, but I need to know if you're willing to hear it." She looked at him. "I'm suspended." "I'm aware. I have a review pending." "I'm aware of that too." "Then you know I can't— Oh, Nora." He used her first name exactly once, and the shift in register was precise enough that she stopped talking. "What happened in that operating room this morning? I've already made 2 phone calls. Whatever review they're threatening you with is going to evaporate. That's not a promise I'm making to get you in a room. That's just what's going to happen. Because the complaint was filed without documentation, and the outcome data doesn't support it, and the surgeon who filed it is going to have a very uncomfortable conversation with the hospital's legal counsel before this day is out." He paused. "What I'm asking about is something separate, something that matters a great deal to me and to several people above my pay grade, which should tell you something about the scale of it." She was quiet for a moment. Outside the door, she could hear the lobby resuming its normal volume, people moving, phones ringing, the small mechanical sounds of a hospital getting back to its routine after the interruption of whatever that had been. "I'll hear it," she said, "but not here. There's a facility in Asheville. We can have you there by this afternoon. I need to make a call first." "Of course." She picked up her bag. "I'll meet your people outside in 20 minutes. He nodded. He picked up his cover from the table and put it back on with the automatic precision of a man who had been wearing that uniform for so long. It was less something he put on and more something he became. One more thing, he said. For what it's worth, what they did to you this morning was wrong. The way it happened was wrong. She looked at him steadily. It happens to a lot of people who don't have a general show-up afterward. He had nothing to say to that. She walked out. Whooped. She made the call from the parking structure across the street, the one where she'd been parking for 14 months because the hospital employee lot was $6 a day and the structure was $4.50, and that was just how she thought about things now, in small economies that added up to something resembling a life built on careful ground. The phone rang 3 times before it was answered. "It's me," she said. A pause on the other end. Then, "I figured I'd hear from you today. Saw the name Alcott on a travel manifest this morning." "Did you know he was coming here?" "I had a suspicion, didn't know it would be today." The voice belonged to a woman named Ida Marsh, who was 61 years old, lived in Fayetteville, and had spent 27 years in signals intelligence before retiring to a life that looked like gardening and was mostly something else. She was the closest thing Nora had to someone who knew the whole picture. What did he want? He said there's a situation. He would say that. There is a situation. There have been 3 situations in the last 18 months, and your name keeps coming up in relation to all of them, which is part of why I told you 8 months ago that the quiet life wasn't going to hold. Nora leaned against the concrete wall of the parking structure. Through the gap in the wall, she could see the hospital entrance, could see Alcott's vehicles still at the curb, the aide standing near the lead vehicle with the practiced stillness of someone trained to wait. "I built something here," she said. "I know." "It wasn't nothing." "I know that too." Ida's voice was even, not unkind. "Is it still there to go back to after this morning?" Nora didn't answer that immediately because the honest answer was complicated in a way she didn't want to compress into a phone call in a parking structure. What she'd built at Hartwell Regional was a version of herself that functioned inside normal parameters. She had an apartment on the east side of town. She had a routine. She had coworkers who knew her as reliable and quiet, and occasionally difficult in ways that never crossed the line into actually problematic. She had a job that used enough of her actual skills to keep her from losing her mind, while also being small enough that nobody asked questions she didn't want to answer. What she did not have was the kind of roots that survived being suspended without documentation and having a general show up in the lobby and salute her in front of the entire day shift. "No," she said. "It's probably not." "Then go hear what he has to say." She hung up and stood there for another minute, looking at the gap in the wall, and then she walked back across the street. She told the aide she needed 15 more minutes and went back inside through the main entrance. Sandra Keogh found her in the lobby, which Nora suspected was not an accident. Sandra looked like a woman who had been running calculations at high speed for the past 40 minutes and had arrived at a set of answers she didn't entirely like. She was wearing that particular expression. Not quite remorse, not quite alarm, something in between that had more to do with institutional self-preservation than anything else. "Nora," she said, "can we—" "I don't have a lot of time," Nora said. "I understand, but I want to— There are some things about this morning that I handled in a way that I—" "Sandra." Nora stopped walking, which forced Sandra to stop too. She kept her voice even. "You sent the suspension email while I was still walking out of your office. You deactivated my badge access before I reached the lobby. The review process you mentioned exists on paper, but you didn't actually initiate it before taking action." She paused. "I'm not going to stand here and have a conversation about process." Sandra's jaw tightened. "Dr. Draper is a very senior—" "I know what he is." She looked at Sandra with something that was not quite pity and not quite anger, but lived somewhere in the territory between them. "You've been doing this job for 9 years. You're good at it, and you just fired a nurse with a clean record and 0 documented incidents in 14 months because a surgeon who throws equipment had a bad morning and needed someone to absorb it." She picked up her bag again. "That's on you, Sandra. That stays on you." She walked away before Sandra could respond. She almost made it back to the exit before Callum Draper stepped out of the elevator. He saw her at the same moment she saw him, and for a half-second they were simply 2 people who had shared a very bad hour that morning, looking at each other across a lobby that was beginning to feel very crowded with everything that hadn't been said between them. He looked different than he had in the OR. In the OR, he'd been charged with that cold, electrical anger. Now he looked like a man who had been watching from a window when the convoy pulled up and had been doing math ever since. He walked toward her. She didn't walk toward him, but she didn't walk away either. "Who is that general?" he said. Not aggressive, more like a man trying to orient himself on a map that had just changed scale. "I'm not going to discuss that with you." "Nora." "Dr. Draper." She said his name the way she'd said Sandra's name, with exactly enough pressure to communicate that the conversation had already reached its useful limit. "You filed a complaint against me based on a mischaracterization of what happened, without reviewing the circulating nurse's documentation, without waiting for the patient outcome data, and without, as far as I can tell, doing anything other than deciding in the moment that you needed somewhere to put your frustration." She let that sit for a second. "I'm not angry about it. I understand how it happened, but I need you to understand something in return." He was very still. "The review you initiated is going to run its course," she said. "And when it does, the documentation is going to show exactly what happened in that OR and exactly what didn't. And whatever happens between now and then," she glanced toward the exit, toward the vehicles at the curb, "you should probably get ahead of it." She walked out. The drive to Asheville took 2 hours and 40 minutes. She rode in the second vehicle, which was less a choice she made and more the natural result of Alcott's aid, opening that door with the silent communication of someone who had done this particular logistical task many times before. There was a second person already in the vehicle. A woman in civilian clothes, early 50s, the compact, deliberate quality of someone whose real job had nothing to do with what her clothes suggested. She introduced herself as Marlene Voss and offered nothing else. Nora looked out the window for most of the drive. The interstate gave way to mountain roads, the kind that required the driver's full attention and eliminated the possibility of anyone in the vehicle pretending the ride was casual. At one point, Voss offered her a folder. Nora held it without opening it for about 10 minutes, then set it on the seat between them. "I'd rather hear it from him," she said. Voss retrieved the folder without comment. The facility outside Asheville was not marked. It sat at the end of a road that didn't appear on commercial maps, behind a perimeter fence that looked agricultural from 200 yards, and was not. She'd been to 3 places that felt like this. She'd tried not to think too carefully about how well she recognized the particular combination of remoteness and infrastructure. They were met at the entrance by a man she didn't know, a lieutenant colonel named Brandt, according to his nameplate, who had the look of someone comfortable with the mechanics of briefing rooms. He walked them through a corridor that smelled like HVAC and fluorescent lighting and institutional carpet, the same smell every facility like this had regardless of where it was located, as if they were all built from the same plans by the same contractor who had only one idea about what the inside of a serious building should smell like. The briefing room held 6 chairs and a screen. Alcott was already there, along with 2 people she didn't recognize and one she did. A man named Ortega, who had been in her unit for 11 months before a knee injury sent him stateside. He nodded at her when she came in. She nodded back. No words were necessary between them. They had the shorthand of people who'd been cold and scared in the same locations. "Sit wherever you want," Alcott said. She sat. The screen came on. What she saw in the next 22 minutes was a situation that had been developing for 8 months across 3 related threads, all of which converged on a location and a timeline and a set of variables that required someone with a very specific combination of skills. She wasn't going to reconstruct the briefing in her head in any detail because she'd learned not to do that, not to turn operational information over and over in her mind in the hours before she'd decided whether she was in or out, because the mental handling of it created a kind of commitment that she preferred to make deliberately. What she would let herself acknowledge was that it was serious, it was time-sensitive, and they were right that her particular background was relevant in ways that were not coincidental. When the screen went off, Alcott looked at her. "Questions?" "Several," she said. "But one first." She looked at Ortega. "Is the intelligence on the secondary location solid, or is it modeled?" "Solid," Ortega said. 3 independent sources confirmed in the last 72 hours. "Okay." She thought for a moment. "How long for the preparation phase?" We'd want 10 days, Brandt said. Ideally 2 weeks. That's not ideal for the timeline you just showed me. No, Alcott agreed. It's not. She was quiet for a moment. The room let her be quiet. That was one thing she had always appreciated about people in rooms like this. They understood that silence was a working condition, not an absence. What's the medical component? She asked. Voss, who had been quiet since the drive, said, potentially significant. The location has civilian presence. We don't have good numbers, but the estimate is 40 to 60 people in the affected zone. What kind of medical support is planned? That's part of what we're asking you to help structure. She looked at Alcott. You're not just asking me to participate. You're asking me to design the medical response component. Among other things, he said. She sat with that for a moment. In the corridor outside, she could hear muffled voices and the distant beep of equipment, the unremarkable sounds of a facility doing its ordinary work around the edges of this extraordinary room. I need 48 hours, she said. We can give you 36, Alcott said. She looked at him. 48. He considered that, with the expression of a man who was choosing between pressing and accepting. He chose accepting. 48 hours, he said. You have somewhere to stay? I'll figure it out. He nodded at Brandt, who slid a card across the table. There's a contact number on there, if you need anything in the meantime. She took the card. She stood up. She picked up her bag, which she had carried into the briefing room because she did not leave bags unattended in places she didn't know, and she walked to the door. Nora, Alcott said. She stopped. I know this is not what you built for yourself, he said. I know what you had back there. I'm not pretending this is simple. She had her hand on the door frame. She didn't turn around. You said the review is going to evaporate, she said. What does that actually mean, in practical terms? It means the complaint is going to be withdrawn, formally, on record. And Draper? A pause. That, Alcott said carefully, may become more complicated than a simple withdrawal. She thought about Patrice standing in the locker bay telling her to fight it. She thought about the 14 months of clean records and difficult cases and silent early mornings in the prep corridor. She thought about Harold Foss, who was currently in the CVICU with a repaired aorta and no idea that the scrub nurse who'd managed his instrument tray had left the building hours ago. She thought about Callum Draper's face when he'd asked who the general was, and the particular quality of the calculation she'd seen behind his eyes. Okay, she said, I'll be in touch in 48 hours. She walked out of the briefing room, down the fluorescent corridor, through the lobby, and out into the late afternoon air that smelled like high-altitude pine and the particular cold clarity of Appalachian October, and she stood there for a moment at the edge of the parking area with her bag over her shoulder, looking at the tree line. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. It was a number she didn't recognize, local area code, not Asheville, not Charlotte. The message was 4 words. We need to talk. She stared at it. Then a second message arrived from the same number, and this one contained a photograph. It was an image of a document, a personnel file by the look of it, with a header she recognized immediately because she had seen it before years ago in a very different context. The document was partially redacted, but the name at the top, visible above the black bars, was not hers. It was Callum Draper's, and the header above it did not belong to any hospital. Her fingers went still on the phone. Somewhere behind her, inside the facility, the briefing room was probably already being cleared, the screen going dark, Alcott and his people moving on to the next item on an agenda that was much larger than her 48-hour window. The convoy that had brought her here would reposition and wait, and the machinery of the thing would keep turning. She looked at the photograph on her phone for a long moment. Then she looked back at the tree line. Whatever she had walked into this morning, the OR, the suspension, the lobby, the salute, this room, this facility, this card in her pocket, and this phone in her hand, it was no longer a single thread. It was several threads. And at least one of them ran through Callum Draper in a direction she had not seen coming. She typed back one word. Where? The response came back in 6 minutes. Coffee shop. Route 70, mile marker 31. 1 hour. She looked at the message for a moment, then at the tree line, then back at the message. An hour put her at the location just before 6 p.m., which was late enough that the mountain light would be going and early enough that a roadside coffee shop would still have people in it. Public, specific, someone who knew how to pick a meeting point. She walked to the edge of the parking area where a civilian rental, a gray sedan that had been arranged at some point during her briefing without her noticing, sat with keys on the front left tire. She picked them up, threw her bag in the back, and drove. Route 70 east of Asheville moved through the kind of terrain that looked peaceful from a car window and was mostly just remote. Switchbacks through second-growth forest, the occasional pull-off with a rusted historical marker, small communities that appeared and disappeared in the space of a quarter mile. Mile marker 31 had a coffee shop that was also a gas station, that was also, apparently, a place where people who needed to talk without being overhead came to do that. She parked at the far end of the lot, away from the pump canopy, and went in. The man was already there. Corner booth, back to the wall, 2 coffees on the table. He was approximately 40, dark-haired, wearing the kind of unremarkable clothes that people who think carefully about blending in select with a great deal of care. He wasn't military, or he wasn't anymore. He had the residual posture but the deliberate civilian softness of someone who'd spent years learning to turn it off. She sat across from him. "You sent the photograph," she said. "Yes." "Who are you?" He wrapped both hands around his coffee mug. "My name is David Farrow. 14 months ago, I was a senior investigator with the Defense Contract Audit Agency. Currently, I'm not employed by anyone." She looked at him steadily. "And the document in the photograph?" "Is part of a file I've been building for 2 years. He looked at her with the direct, calculating calm of someone who had been rehearsing this conversation and was now finding that the actual version of it was slightly different than the one he'd prepared for. Callum Draper is not who he says he is. Not entirely. "Explain that." "He did his surgical residency at Forest University Medical Center in Virginia. That part is real. His licensing, his board certifications, his clinical record at Hartwell, all legitimate. But before medical school, there's a window of approximately 4 years where his documented history is thin in ways that are very specific." He slid the phone across the table. Not the photograph this time, but a new image. A different document. Names, dates, a project designation she didn't recognize. "We believe he was recruited during that window by a private intelligence contractor called Meridian Group. Have you heard of them?" She had. Everyone in her former line of work had heard of Meridian Group the way you heard of a category of weather. Something to be aware of, to account for, not to dismiss. "They're not active anymore," she said. "Their public-facing structure isn't, but the people who built Meridian didn't retire. They reorganized." He tapped the document on the phone screen. Draper's connection to them was never fully severed. He's been functioning as an asset inside Hartwell Regional for the past 3 years, providing information, specifically about patients, their identities, their networks, anything that passes through a major regional medical center that might be useful to people who pay very well for that kind of access. She sat very still. "The retractor incident this morning," she said. "The suspension. I don't think that was planned. I think you walked into his OR at a moment when he was already under pressure and the situation presented itself, and he made a decision to remove you from the building before you were in it long enough to notice something you shouldn't." Farrow paused. "Or before someone from your past showed up and made it complicated for him." He didn't know Alcott was coming. No, but he knew something was moving. People like Draper always know when the weather is changing. He pulled the phone back. "What I need from you is a decision. I've been building this case for 2 years. I have documentation, I have 2 corroborating sources, but I have a problem with continuity of evidence across one specific period that makes the file incomplete. Without closing that gap, a federal prosecutor looks at what I have and says it's interesting but not prosecutable." "What's the gap?" "A patient transfer that happened 13 months ago, 2 weeks before you started at Hartwell." He looked at her steadily. "The patient's record was modified after the fact. I need someone with direct knowledge of Hartwell's internal documentation systems and clinical workflow to testify to what the original record would have shown and what the modification means procedurally." She understood then why her name had surfaced in relation to this, and it had nothing to do with what she'd done in the military and everything to do with the 14 months she'd spent as a scrub nurse in OR3, learning a building from the inside out. "I've been at Hartwell 14 months, she said. "The transfer was 13 months ago. I wasn't there yet." No, but the documentation of it runs through systems that you have used every day since. And the modification pattern matches a behavioral signature that someone with your level of procedural knowledge can identify and explain to a non-expert in a way that makes it land. He paused. I've watched your work. You're meticulous. You cross-check. You document things that other nurses consider optional. 14 months of that creates a foundation that an expert witness doesn't have. She looked at him for a long moment. Outside the window, the last daylight was going orange and thin over the ridgeline. You've been in this building for 2 years, she said, building a case against an asset inside a hospital. And you're sitting across from a woman who was fired this morning and has a 48-hour window before she makes a completely separate decision about a completely separate situation. She let that sit. What makes you think your timeline aligns with mine? It doesn't, he said simply. That's why I'm here tonight instead of waiting, because after tonight, your trajectory changes. Alcott takes you in a direction, and the window closes. He set his own phone down on the table, screen up, with the document visible that she didn't look at yet. I'm not asking you to choose between them. I'm asking you to understand that these two things are connected. Draper's relationship with Meridian Group's successor organization, the same people that Alcott briefed you about today, or some of the same people, that's not a coincidence. That's the same problem from two different angles. The coffee in front of her had gone cold. She hadn't touched it. She thought about that photograph, the header on the document. She thought about Callum Draper in the lobby asking who the general was, and whether the calculation she'd seen behind his eyes was the calculation of a man protecting his authority in his hospital, or a man calculating exposure in a much larger structure. She looked down at the phone on the table. The document was a patient record, partially redacted, but the metadata visible at the bottom showed modification timestamps, 2 of them, 18 days apart. In a clinical documentation system, a record with 2 modification timestamps and no addendum notation was a record that had been altered without disclosure. That was a thing she could speak to, clearly and specifically. I need to verify your identity, she said. Not what you told me. Actually verify it. I'd expect that, he said. He slid a second card across the table, different from Brandt's card. An agency contact, a case file reference number, a verification code. Call that number. Give them the code. They'll confirm I am who I said I am and that the investigation is real. She took the card without looking away from him. And if I say yes, what does the timeline look like? You testify before a federal grand jury. It could be in 30 days. It could be in 90. Depends on how the case consolidates. He paused. Before that happens, you'd need to be insulated from retaliation, which, given the direction Alcott is taking you, may happen organically. May. There are no certainties here. I'm not going to sit here and tell you there are. She appreciated that more than she would have appreciated a cleaner pitch. She picked up the card, tucked it behind Brandt's card in her jacket pocket, and stood up. I'll call the number tonight, she said. You'll hear from me by tomorrow morning. He nodded. She left. Eat. She drove back toward Asheville on Route 70 with the window cracked and the cold mountain air coming in, and the thing she'd just been handed sitting in the front of her mind like an object she was turning over to find the weight of it. 2 years ago, she had built a life designed specifically to prevent eventualities like this one. She had chosen a medium-sized city, a large enough institution that she wouldn't be visible, a role that was skilled but not prominent. She had not made close friends. She had not shared her history. She had shown up, done the work, gone home. What she had not accounted for was that the work itself, the meticulous, documented, procedurally rigorous work she did every single day because she didn't know any other way to do a job, had created exactly the kind of evidentiary foundation that a federal investigator needed. She had made herself useful in spite of herself. She called Ida Marsh from the car. Meridian Group, she said when Ida picked up. A pause that lasted approximately 1 second longer than usual. Where did you hear that? Asheville, tonight. Someone named David Farrow, DCAA, says he's been running a 2-year investigation, says Draper has been an asset. Hold on. She heard Ida put the phone down, heard the specific background noise of Ida's house, the radio she kept on low in the kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator. and then a longer silence that meant Ida was checking something. When she came back, her voice had a quality Nora had learned to pay attention to. Careful. Not alarmed, not dismissive. Careful. Pharaoh is real, Ida said. The investigation is real. I didn't know it had gotten as far as a named asset inside a medical institution, but I'm not surprised. A pause. The Draper connection, if that's true, it explains some things about how certain information moved in the last 2 years. Does it connect to what Alcott briefed me on today? Possibly. Probably. Ida's voice went quieter. Nora, be careful about the next 48 hours. Not because of Alcott, and not because of Pharaoh. Because if Draper is an asset, and his handlers know that a general showed up at that hospital today and saluted a woman they may have flagged, they're going to be asking questions about you that you don't want asked right now. She absorbed that. How fast would that move? Fast enough that I'd sleep somewhere other than where they'd expect tonight. She changed hotels. She found one on the northwest side of Asheville, paid cash, used the backup ID she kept in the interior pocket of her bag, a habit she'd maintained without ever quite deciding to, and was in the room by 8:30. She called the verification number on Pharaoh's card. It was answered on the second ring by a recorded system that took the case file number and verification code and confirmed in the flat bureaucratic language of federal process that the investigation designation was active and the agent of record had authorization to conduct witness interviews. She sat on the edge of the bed with both cards in front of her on the nightstand and looked at them for a while. Then she opened her bag and took out the folder that Voss had offered her in the vehicle, the one she'd declined to read. She'd slid it into the bag instead of returning it, which had been a small instinct she hadn't examined until now. She read it. The operation Alcott wanted her for was structured around a location in the western part of the state, a facility that had been operating under a commercial cover for approximately 18 months and had, in the last 60 days, begun receiving what the intelligence community was characterizing as a significant civilian presence in ways that did not match the commercial cover's stated purpose. The concern was two-layered. First, what was happening inside the facility. Second, what would happen to the civilians if an extraction or interdiction operation was conducted without adequate medical planning? That was her job, not the extraction. The aftermath of the extraction, and specifically the medical triage and stabilization of anywhere from 30 to 60 people who might be in varying states of distress, malnutrition, injury, or worse. She had done versions of this 3 times in her military career. Each time had been different. Each time had been worse than the version she'd planned for. She kept reading. There was a section near the back of the folder, the kind of section that gets placed at the back because whoever assembled the briefing material knows it's the section that will create the most questions, that listed the operational assets being considered for the medical component. Names, specialties, availability status. Her name was not on the list. There was a handwritten note in the margin next to the last name on the list, in the careful block lettering she recognized as Alcott's. Reeves preferred, non-negotiable. She read that 3 times. Then she set the folder down. Non-negotiable was not a phrase Alcott used carelessly. She had known him for 6 years in contexts where language meant things, and non-negotiable coming from him in a handwritten margin note meant that someone above him had pushed back on her name and he had held the line. She thought about what Ida had said. They're going to be asking questions about you that you don't want asked right now. She thought about Draper's handlers, whoever they were, receiving information tonight about a general who'd shown up at a hospital in Charlotte and saluted a scrub nurse. She thought about what questions that would generate and how fast and what the answers might lead them to. She pulled out her phone and sent a message to Pharaoh. Verified. I'm in, but I need something from you first. I need to know if Draper's handlers have a flag on my name. His response came back in 4 minutes. Working on it. Check back at 0600. She set the phone down and lay back on the bed with her jacket still on and her bag within reach and stared at the ceiling in the particular way she had of resting without fully releasing anything, keeping the background processes running while the surface went quiet, the way she'd learned to sleep in environments where fully sleeping was not an option. At 11:43 p.m., her phone buzzed. Not Pharaoh, not Alcott, not Ida. An unknown number, no area code. International routing. The message was 7 words. "We know who you are, Sergeant Reeves." She sat up. She was already moving. Bag off the bed, jacket zipped, shoes on, a 30-second check of the room that was mostly muscle memory, when the second message arrived. "Draper sends his regards. Be somewhere else by morning." She stood at the door of the hotel room and looked at those words on her screen for exactly the 3 seconds it took her to make the decision she'd been moving toward since the moment the convoy pulled up outside Hartwell Regional that morning. She was done being somewhere else. She called Alcott's aide's number, the one on Brandt's card, and when he answered on the second ring, she said, in the clipped direct register of someone who has shifted out of deliberation and into action, "Tell the general I'm in. Tell him 48 hours just became 12. And tell him we have a secondary problem inside Hartwell Regional that is connected to his primary operation in ways his briefing did not account for." She paused. "I need a secure location. I need Pharaoh read into whatever Alcott's running, and I need someone to explain to me why Callum Draper's handlers know my military rank." A pause on the other end. Then, "Hold, please." She did not hold. She opened the hotel room door, checked the corridor in both directions. Empty, fluorescent, a laundry cart sitting outside room 214, and walked toward the stairwell. She had reached the second-floor landing when the aide came back on. "General Alcott wants to know if you're in a secure location." "No," she said. "That's why I'm moving." "He's activating a team. Can you get to—" "I know where to go." She pushed through the ground floor door into the hotel's back parking lot, hit the cold air, kept moving. "Tell him I'll be at the facility in 40 minutes, and tell him to have Pharaoh there." She was in the rental car, engine running, when she remembered something Pharaoh had said. "I've watched your work. You're meticulous." She thought about that. She thought about 14 months of documentation, of double-checked counts, of patient records entered with precision and maintained without modification. She thought about what a 2-year federal investigation looked like when it finally found the piece that made the whole thing prosecutable. She pulled out of the lot onto Route 70 going west, headlights cutting through the mountain dark, and she thought about Callum Draper sitting in his office right now, or standing at a window, or making a phone call, doing the math on how badly the day had gone and whether the steps he'd taken were sufficient. They weren't. She was going to make sure they weren't. She was doing 72 miles an hour on a dark mountain road when the lights appeared in her rearview mirror. 2 vehicles closing fast, no headlight patterns that matched civilian driving. They were not police. She pressed the accelerator and reached for her phone. She didn't call Alcott's aide back. She needed both hands. The 2 vehicles behind her were running dark. No headlights now, just the ambient glow of instrument panels visible as shapes in her rear view, closing the gap with the particular deliberateness of drivers who knew where this road went and weren't worried about matching her speed. That told her something. They weren't trying to force her off the road. They were hurting. There was a difference, and the difference mattered because hurting meant a destination, and a destination meant someone waiting at it. She ran the road ahead in her mind. She'd driven it once an hour ago in the other direction, which was not ideal but was enough. 2 miles east, there was a pull-off with a historical marker. Beyond that, the road dropped into a series of tight descending curves before a small community with a gas station that might or might not be open at midnight. 4 miles west, the direction she was going, the road straightened briefly before a junction with a county route that ran north toward the facility. They would know about the junction. If they'd planned this, they knew about the junction. She took the pull-off. Not the historical marker one. She passed that. There was a second one, shorter, barely a gravel depression off the roadside where the shoulder widened for no obvious reason, the kind of place that exists on mountain roads because the terrain made it convenient at some point, and nobody ever removed it. She hit it at 45, felt the tires drop off the asphalt and onto packed gravel, killed her headlights, and stopped. The 2 vehicles went past her on the road in under 4 seconds, running dark, doing at least 80. They didn't slow. She sat in the dark with the engine idling and her hands on the wheel for 10 seconds, watching the road. Then she pulled back onto Route 70 going west, headlights back on, and called the aide. 2 vehicles followed me from the hotel. They've passed my position. They're ahead of me now between my current location and your facility. Copy. A pause. The sound of the aide relaying this, someone else's voice in the background, unintelligible. General Alcott wants to know your exact position. She gave him the mile marker. They know the junction. Don't let me drive into it. We have a team mobile. Alternate extraction route. There's a fire road off Route 70, approximately 1.4 miles east of the junction. It's gated, but the gate isn't locked. Take it north for 2 miles. It connects to a service road that runs to the facility's east perimeter. Understood. She paused. Tell Alcott I need Farrow physically present when I arrive. Not on a call. In the room. I'll relay that. She drove west with the particular focused attention of someone allocating cognitive resources carefully. Enough for the road, enough for the mirrors, enough for the calculation of distance and timing that told her the 2 vehicles ahead would reach the junction in approximately 90 seconds and would stop or reposition when she didn't appear. She found the fire road gate with 17 seconds to spare, by her estimate. The gate was a standard Forestry Service barrier. Steel pipe, padlock hasp, no padlock. She was out of the car, through the gate, back in the car, and moving north on the fire road in under 40 seconds. The road was rough and unpaved, and the rental sedan bottomed out twice on drainage cuts before the surface improved, but it held. And 2 miles north, the tree line opened onto a gravel service road with the facility's eastern fence visible through the dark as a line of motion sensor lights that had just come on. Someone inside had triggered the lights for her. She was through the perimeter checkpoint 2 minutes later. Awesome. Farrow was in the facility when she arrived, which meant Alcott had either already moved to bring him in before her call or had done it in the 12 minutes since. She didn't ask which. It didn't matter. What mattered was the room they put her in. A different one from the afternoon briefing, smaller, with a table that had actual equipment on it now. A secure laptop, a document scanner, 2 hard drives and evidence bags, and a printed timeline that ran across 3 sheets of paper taped end to end along the far wall. Alcott was there. Farrow was there. Voss was there. Ortega was in the corner with a laptop and the expression of a man who had been awake for 20 hours and was running on something other than sleep. Talk to me about the vehicles, Alcott said. 2, dark, professional driving. They were herding, not pursuing. They expected the junction to be their endpoint. She set her bag down. They know the facility is somewhere in this area. They may not have the exact location. They don't have it, Voss said. We've maintained site security, but knowing the general area is enough if they're patient. They're not going to be patient, Farrow said. He was standing near the timeline wall with his arms crossed, and the look of a man whose 2-year investigation had just accelerated past his planned timeline by a factor he was still calculating. The message she received, Draper sends his regards. That's a tell. Draper wouldn't authorize that kind of contact on his own. That language went up the chain and came back down as a decision, which means his handlers made a risk assessment tonight and decided that removing her from the picture was worth the exposure. Removing from the picture, Nora said flatly. Intimidation first. They don't know yet whether you're an operational problem or a legal one. The message was designed to make you run. He looked at her. You didn't run. I drove into a forest at midnight. That's not exactly standing my ground. It is, actually. He turned to the timeline wall. Here's where we are. The 2-year investigation has been working backward from financial flows, payments made through a series of medical billing subsidiaries that have no corresponding patient volume to justify them. Ghost billing, essentially, but the purpose isn't fraud for profit. It's cover. The payments are a channel for moving money to people who provide information. He touched a point on the timeline. Draper's name appeared in the financial flow 18 months ago. Small amounts, irregular intervals, structured specifically to stay below federal reporting thresholds. Smurfing, Ortega said from the corner. Correct. The problem was establishing what he was providing in exchange. Medical billing fraud is federal, but the people doing it have enough distance between themselves and the money that prosecuting any individual is difficult without behavioral evidence. Farrow looked at Nora. The patient record modification 13 months ago. The one I showed you tonight. That's the behavioral evidence. But I need someone who can explain to a grand jury, in terms a non-specialist can follow, what the modification means in the context of how those records are supposed to work. Not just that it happened, what it cost. What did it cost? Alcott asked. Not to Farrow, to Nora. She thought about what she'd seen in the partial record on Farrow's phone, the modification timestamps. The type of record it was, a transfer authorization, which in a hospital system carries clinical, legal, and insurance implications simultaneously. If a transfer authorization is modified after the fact without an addendum notation, she said slowly, it means the original authorization, whatever it said, whoever signed it, is gone. Replaced. And in a clinical system, that record is the basis for insurance billing, liability documentation, and continuity of care. You modify it without disclosure, you can change who was responsible for a clinical decision when it was made, and what the patient's status was at the time. She paused. Depending on what was changed, you could make it look like a different physician authorized a transfer, or that a patient was stable when they weren't, or that consent was obtained when it wasn't. In this case, Farrow said, the modification changed the authorizing physician's name. The original record showed Draper's name. The modified record showed a physician who left Hartwell 4 months later for a position in another state. He moved the liability. And the patient, a man named in the file as a federal contractor with security clearance, was transferred to a facility where his records became accessible to people who should not have had access to them. The room was quiet for a moment. How long to prepare your testimony? Alcott asked. That's not the most urgent question right now, she said. He looked at her. The most urgent question is what Draper is doing tonight. She moved to the timeline wall and looked at the sequence of dates. He made a decision today. Fast. He filed a complaint against me within an hour of the OR incident, got me suspended and out of the building before noon. That's not the behavior of someone protecting his authority in a hospital. That's the behavior of someone managing a timeline. She found the date she was looking for. What else happened at Hartwell Regional in the last 48 hours? Farrow and Alcott exchanged a look. There was a patient admission yesterday, Voss said carefully. Someone connected to our primary operation, brought in through the ER, stabilized, admitted to the 4th floor under a name that's a known alias. The room calibrated around that statement. Draper has 4th floor privileges, Nora said. Yes. And he knows this patient is there. We don't know that for certain. He filed a complaint against a scrub nurse within an hour of a surgical case. That is not what people do when they have nothing else on their mind. She looked at Alcott. You need to move that patient. Tonight. Alcott looked at Voss. Voss was already reaching for her phone. There's a protocol issue, Voss said, not lowering the phone. Moving a patient in federal custody from a civilian medical facility at midnight without a court order. How long for a court order? Hours. A judge needs to be woken up. The filing has to... Then don't move the patient, Nora said. Lock the room. Restrict access. Put someone physically in that corridor who isn't hospital staff. She thought for a second. And pull Draper's access badge remotely, right now, tonight. On what authority? It's on the authority of a federal investigation that has his name in the financial flows and a documented record modification. She looked at Farrow. You have enough for an emergency access restriction? Technically, yes. I'd need to make a call. Make it. He made it. It took 47 minutes. During those 47 minutes, she sat at the secure laptop with Ortega and walked him through the documentation structure of Hartwell Regional's clinical record system. Not from memory, but from the working knowledge of 14 months of daily use, the specific architecture of how records were structured, where modification on timestamps lived in the metadata, how an addendum notation was supposed to look, and what its absence meant at a system level. Ortega typed. She dictated. By the end of it, they had a 12-page technical document that Farrow said was the clearest explanation of the evidentiary significance he'd seen in 2 years of working the case. You didn't learn this in a scrub nurse certification program, he said. No, she agreed. He didn't push on it. Smart enough to know when not to. At 2:17 a.m., Farrow received confirmation that a federal magistrate had issued an emergency order restricting access to the fourth-floor room at Hartwell Regional. 2 U.S. Marshals were en route to the hospital to enforce it physically. At 2:41 a.m., Hartwell Regional's security system logged an attempt to access the fourth floor using Draper's badge. The badge had been deactivated at 2:09. The attempt was logged, time-stamped, and automatically flagged in the security system. Voss showed Nora the notification on her tablet without comment. "He was in the building," Nora said. "He was in the building. At 2:40 in the morning." "Yes." She looked at the timestamp. She thought about what Ida Marsh had said. People like Draper always know when the weather is changing. She thought about him standing at a window or making a call or deciding somewhere between midnight and 2 a.m. that the situation required action he couldn't delay. "The Marshals," she said. "Are they there yet?" "ETA 4 minutes when the badge attempt was made." He didn't know that. "No." "Does he know his badge was flagged?" "The system doesn't notify the badge holder. He'd know it didn't work. He wouldn't know why." She sat back. "He's going to run. Or he's going to try to contain it another way," Alcott said from across the room. He'd been quiet for the last 30 minutes, which with Alcott meant he'd been thinking and had arrived at something. "Farrow, how solid is your financial documentation?" "Solid enough to survive a defense challenge. I've had it reviewed." "Solid enough for an arrest warrant?" "With the badge access attempt tonight? Yes. I'd say yes." Alcott looked at Voss. Something passed between them in the compressed language of people who have worked together long enough that full sentences are optional. "Make the call," he said. Voss stepped out. Nora looked at Alcott. "You knew this was going to accelerate when you came to Hartwell today." "I suspected it might." "You brought me into a situation that was already moving and didn't tell me the full picture in the briefing." He met her eyes. "I told you what you needed to know to make an informed decision. The Draper element was not confirmed when I briefed you. It became confirmed tonight, partly because of what happened after I left. Partly because you put me in the building and waited to see what moved." He didn't deny that. She hadn't expected him to. "Was I a target or an asset?" she asked. "Both," he said. "That's honest. Both." She looked at him for a moment longer than was comfortable and then let it go, because being angry about it was a luxury she didn't have time for right now. And because, and this was the part she was less comfortable admitting, it had worked. She was in a secure facility at 3 in the morning with more information than she'd had 24 hours ago, and the machinery of federal process moving in directions that 2 days ago had been stalled. "The primary operation," she said, "the facility outside the western part of the state. The timeline moved?" "It moved," he said. "Draper's handlers know we're active. They're going to move too." He paused. "I need an answer from you, not in 48 hours, now." She thought about the folder she'd read in the hotel room, the handwritten margin note. Non-negotiable. She thought about 30 to 60 people in a facility whose situation was going to become significantly more dangerous in the next 72 hours if the people running that facility decided to reduce their exposure. She thought about Harold Foss in the CVICU with a repaired aorta. She thought about Patrice in the locker bay, saying there's something about you that doesn't fit. She thought about 14 months of a life that had been, on some level, a holding pattern. Not a retreat, not a failure, but a pause that had maybe lasted about as long as it was going to last, regardless of what she'd decided tonight. "I'm in," she said. "Full commitment. Medical planning lead." Alcott nodded. No visible relief. He'd expected this, or he'd built the whole day around expecting it, which was either admirable or manipulative, and was probably both. "Brant will start your operational integration at 0600, he said. "Get a few hours if you can." She almost laughed at that. "Where's the nearest secure rest facility?" "Down the hall, second left. There are 6 bunks. Ortega's already claimed one." She picked up her bag. "Nora!" Alcott's voice again. She stopped. "The arrest warrant for Draper. When it executes, it's going to be public. Hartwell Regional is going to have to manage that internally. There's going to be a statement." "I know." "Your name is going to come up in the context of the investigation, not the operational piece. The federal investigation, Farrow's case." "I know," she said again. I want to make sure you've thought about what that means for... I've thought about it. She turned to look at him. What it means is that Sandra Keogh is going to have a very difficult conversation with the hospital's legal team. What it means is that the suspension filed against me this morning is going to become, in about 72 hours, the most documented case of retaliatory administrative action in the history of that institution. She held his gaze. What it means is that the complaint is not just going to be withdrawn. It's going to be on the record, in a federal case file, as an action taken by an asset to remove a witness from the facility before she could document what she'd already seen. Alcott was quiet for a moment. That's a significant claim. The badge access attempt at 2:41 a.m. supports it. A surgeon doesn't drive to a hospital in the middle of the night to access a specific floor, unless something on that floor is urgent. The complaint against me this morning removed me from the building and deactivated my badge before I could have any reason to be near the 4th floor. She paused. I'm not saying he knew specifically what I might see. I'm saying he cleared the board. Farrow, from across the room, said quietly, "That's going in the supplemental filing." She left them to it. She slept for 2 hours and 40 minutes. Not well, not fully, but enough. She dreamed about the mountain road in the dark, the 2 vehicles in the mirror, the specific quality of that moment when she'd pulled off the road and killed the headlights and sat in the silence of the decision she'd already made. She was in the cafeteria at 5:15 with bad coffee and a granola bar she'd found in her bag when Ortega came in looking like a man who had not slept at all. "Draper's in custody," he said. She looked up. 4:18 a.m. He was picked up at his home address. Did not resist. Ortega poured himself coffee with the mechanical precision of someone operating past the threshold of normal tiredness. His attorney was on the phone before the arresting agents reached their vehicle. Of course he was. Hospital board has been notified. They're convening an emergency session at 8 a.m. He sat down across from her. There's going to be press. I know. He looked at her with the direct, unvarnished attention that came from having been cold and scared in the same places. You knew this was going to happen when you decided to stay. I knew something was going to happen, she said. I didn't know the shape of it. Are you okay with the shape of it? She thought about that honestly, because he'd earned an honest answer, and because dishonest ones were a waste of time between people who knew each other the way they did. Ask me in a week, she said. He accepted that. At 6:03, her phone buzzed with a message from a number she recognized as Hartwell Regional's main administrative line, which meant someone at the hospital at 6 in the morning had found her personal cell number and used it. The message was from Sandra Keogh. It read, I need to speak with you, please. Before 8 o'clock. She stared at it. She thought about Sandra looking at her desk. She thought about the suspension email sent while she was still walking out of the office. She typed back, I'll call you at 7. She drank her coffee and waited, and at 6:51 her phone buzzed again. Not Sandra this time. Farrow. Supplemental filing submitted at 0600. Federal judge signed off on the expanded warrant at 0638. Draper's financial records, hospital records, and personal communications are all now subject to seizure. A pause, then a second message. There's something in the preliminary communications review you need to see. I'm sending it to the secure terminal. Look at it before your 7 o'clock call. She went to the secure terminal. The document Farrow had flagged was a text thread pulled from Draper's personal phone covering the last 72 hours. The earlier messages were routine. Scheduling, a conversation with what appeared to be a colleague, a reminder about a dinner reservation that he had clearly not kept. The last 6 messages were not routine. They were between Draper and a contact listed in his phone as a single initial, R. The thread began 36 hours ago. R. Alcott is in motion. Do you have a problem? Draper. Not yet. I'm managing it. R. The nurse, the one from the OER. She needs to be gone before he makes contact. Draper. I'm handling it. R. Handle it today, not tomorrow. The next message was timestamped to 9:53 a.m., approximately 40 minutes after she'd left Sandra Keogh's office. Draper. It's done. She's out of the building. She read that line 3 times, the cold precision of it. It's done. Like a task completed, like clearing a room. The final message in the thread was from R, timestamped at 11:14 p.m., right around the time she'd been changing hotels. R. She's not running. Escalate. She sat back from the terminal. The suspension this morning, the instant complaint, the speed of Sandra's email, the badge deactivation before she reached the lobby. None of that had been Draper's institutional ego or his reflexive need to assert authority after a bad morning in the OR. It had been an instruction. And somewhere behind the initial R, there was a structure. A network that had known Alcott was moving, had identified her as a problem, and had given Callum Draper an order that he had carried out inside a hospital in Charlotte, North Carolina, as efficiently as any surgical procedure he'd ever completed. She pulled out her phone. She called Sandra at exactly 7 a.m. Sandra answered on the first ring, which meant she'd been holding the phone. "Thank you for calling," Sandra said. Her voice had the quality of someone who had been awake all night, arriving at decisions she didn't want to make. "I need to tell you something." "Okay." "Dr. Draper spoke to me yesterday morning before the complaint was filed, before the OR incident. He came to my office at 6:15. A pause. "He told me that if you were involved in any adverse incident during the day's cases, I should move immediately on administrative action. He said it was a hospital liability issue and that I shouldn't ask questions about the reasoning." Nora was very still. "He pre-positioned you," she said. "Yes." Sandra's voice was thin. "I didn't ask why. I should have asked why. She stopped. "There's going to be an investigation. The board said this morning that everything from yesterday is under review." "Sandra?" She kept her voice even. "When the investigators contact you, tell them exactly what you told me just now. The time, the conversation, the instruction. Don't edit it." "I know." A pause. "Nora, I'm sorry. For how it was handled. For not—" "Tell the investigators," she said. "That's what matters now." She hung up. She sat for a moment in the quiet of the early morning facility, with Ortega's coffee mug steaming on the other side of the table, and the sounds of the place waking up around her, and the document on the secure terminal still visible from where she sat. It's done. She's out of the building. She thought about that, about how efficiently it had worked, how completely, how a single phone call before 6:15 in the morning had set in motion a sequence of events that by noon had her standing in a lobby with a cardboard box and a deactivated badge. She thought about how close it had come to working, how many times and how many buildings across, how many years someone like Draper had done something like this, and it had simply worked, cleanly, without a general showing up at exactly the wrong moment. She thought about the contact R, still unidentified, still mobile, still, as far as she knew, operating. She pulled up Farrow's message again. "There's something in the preliminary communications review you need to see." She had seen it, but she wasn't sure she'd seen all of it. She went back to the terminal and scrolled past the text thread to the attached metadata. The contact listed as R had a phone number. The number had been routed through 2 relay services, which was standard for anyone trying to maintain communication security. But the final relay, the one closest to the physical device, had a carrier registration. She ran the carrier registration through the facility's lookup system. The account was registered to a medical institution. Not Hartwell Regional. A different institution entirely. A hospital in Raleigh, approximately 2 hours east, called Pemberton General Medical Center. She stared at that for a long moment. Then she pulled up everything she could find about Pemberton General in the time she had before Brand arrived at 600 for her operational integration briefing. It took her 4 minutes to find what she wasn't looking for. Pemberton General Medical Center had, 14 months ago, hired a new chief of surgical services. His name was listed in the administrative directory with a photograph she didn't recognize, credentials she'd never encountered, and a professional history that looked entirely legitimate. But the photograph, when she looked at it long enough, was familiar in the specific way that a face is familiar when you've seen it in a different context, under a different name, in a set of circumstances that have spent 14 months living in a compartment of your memory that you deliberately don't open. She had seen that face before. Not at Hartwell. Not in a hospital. In a place that had nothing to do with medicine. She picked up the phone and called Farrow's direct line. He answered in 2 rings. "The contact R," she said. "Pull the institutional registration on the relay carrier. I think your investigation just got a second subject. Farrow called back in 11 minutes. She was on her second cup of bad coffee and had pulled everything publicly available on Pemberton General's Chief of Surgical Services, a man listed in the administrative directory as Dr. Raymond Ashford, when her phone buzzed and she answered before the second ring completed. "You're right," Farrow said. He didn't sound surprised exactly. He sounded like a man watching the last piece of a structure click into place and recognizing with a particular exhausted satisfaction that the structure was larger than he'd originally drawn it. The relay carrier registration traces back to a device that connected to Pemberton General's internal network on 14 separate occasions over the past 8 months. The device is registered to a shell entity, but the network access logs don't lie. "Raymond Ashford," she said. "We're pulling his background now. How do you know that name?" "I don't know that name," she said. "I know his face. From somewhere that has nothing to do with medicine and nothing to do with North Carolina." She paused. "I need access to a classified personnel database. Can Alcott authorize that from here?" "Give me 10 minutes." It took 8. Brandt came in personally with a terminal authorization code and the particular expression of a man who had been told to ask no questions and was doing that very effectively. She typed in the name she remembered, not Ashford, the other one, the one from the context where she'd seen that face, and waited while the system ran it. The file that came back was 43 pages. 31 of those pages were redacted to varying degrees, but the photograph on page 1 was the same face she'd seen in the Pemberton General Administrative Directory, and the operational history visible between the black bars was enough. The man currently serving as Chief of Surgical Services at Pemberton General Medical Center had spent 9 years under a different identity in a different country, doing work that was technically deniable and practically was not. He had been flagged for termination of relationship by 2 separate agencies on grounds that appeared in the visible text as conduct inconsistent with operational parameters, which was the specific bureaucratic language used when someone had decided to keep working in the same space but without the authorization or the accountability that came with it. He hadn't stopped. He'd reorganized. She printed the photograph, the operational summary, and the flag notations. She put them in a folder. She carried the folder to the room where Alcott was, knocked once, and went in without waiting. He looked up from a map spread across the table. She set the folder in front of him. "Your primary operation and Farrow's investigation are the same operation," she said. "The facility in Western North Carolina, the financial network running through Hartwell Regional, the asset you know as Raymond Ashford at Pemberton General, they're all one structure. Draper isn't a peripheral asset. He's a node in a network that runs from a regional hospital billing system to a facility where 60 civilians are currently being held, and the man running the network has a face I recognize from a briefing I attended 4 years ago in a building that no longer officially exists." Alcott looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he looked up at her with an expression she had seen on his face once before, in a very different room, after a very different piece of information had landed on a table between them. "How confident are you?" he said. "Completely." He closed the folder. He picked up his phone. Whatever call he made, it lasted 4 minutes, and she heard his side of it in fragments. "Consolidate." "Yes, same target set. She's confirmed the identification. Move the timeline to 48 hours. I need authorization for the Pemberton warrant concurrent with the Western operation." And when he put the phone down, the room had a different quality. The way rooms do when the decision that has been building for days finally gets made, and everything that comes after it is execution rather than deliberation. "We move in 48 hours, he said, "both locations simultaneously. The Western facility and Pemberton General." He looked at her. "Your role expands, medical planning lead for the Western facility and primary identification witness for the Pemberton arrest." "I understand." "The identification puts you in a federal courtroom eventually." "I know." He studied her. "You've been running from this for 14 months. Not from the work. From the exposure, the visibility." She didn't answer that immediately, because it was true and deserved more than a quick denial. "I was tired," she said finally. "Not of the work, of what the work cost." She looked at the closed folder on the table. 14 months of quiet didn't fix that. It just deferred it. He nodded slowly. "The quiet ended yesterday morning." "The quiet ended a long time ago," she said. "Yesterday morning, I just stopped pretending otherwise." "Say, The next 47 hours moved the way operational preparation always moves, in a rhythm that alternated between dense, exhausting work and the specific suspended quality of waiting for conditions to align. She planned medical response protocols for a facility whose internal layout she knew only from satellite imagery and one survivor account. She cross-referenced supply lists against casualty estimates. She identified the three most likely categories of medical need: malnutrition, dehydration, untreated traumatic injury, and built triage protocols around them, then revised those protocols twice when new information about the facility's conditions came in and changed her baseline assumptions. She slept 4 hours the first night and 3 the second. She ate when someone put food in front of her. She talked to Ortega for 20 minutes on the second afternoon about nothing operational, about a hiking trail he'd been on in New Mexico, about whether the coffee at this facility was worse than the coffee at the last facility they'd both been in, about the particular absurdity of caring about coffee when you were 48 hours from an operation. And those 20 minutes were the most human she felt in the entire preparation period, which told her something about the cost of what she was doing that she filed away to examine later. Farrow came to her twice during those 47 hours with updates on the federal case. The first time to tell her that Draper had retained a criminal defense attorney and had declined to answer questions without counsel present, which was expected and changed nothing about the strength of the documentary evidence. The second time to tell her that the federal grand jury had been convened and that her testimony was formally scheduled for 18 days out, and that the technical document she'd prepared with Ortega had been reviewed by the prosecutor's office and described as the clearest lay explanation of clinical record modification they had encountered in a case of this type. She didn't feel satisfaction about that exactly. She felt something more specific: the recognition that the 14 months of meticulous, careful, precisely documented work she'd done at Hartwell Regional had not been wasted, had not been hiding, had been building something, even when she hadn't known what. The operation executed at 0500 on a Thursday morning, 49 hours after she'd stood at the edge of the facility parking lot looking at the tree line. She wasn't on the entry team. Her position was forward medical staging, 300 meters from the facility perimeter, with a team of 4, 2 combat medics, 1 trauma nurse, and a physician's assistant named Weller who had done 3 deployments and had the calm, slightly detached competence of someone who had made peace with working in uncomfortable conditions. She ran the triage station. When the first civilians came out, 12 minutes after entry, walking assisted in worse condition than the most recent estimates had suggested, she was the first person they reached. The next 4 hours were the kind of work that doesn't leave room for anything except the immediate problem in front of you. 31 people total, ranging from a 14-year-old with dehydration severe enough to require IV resuscitation to a woman in her 50s with an untreated fracture that had been splinted badly and had begun to affect the surrounding soft tissue. Nobody died. 2 cases required urgent evacuation to a trauma center. The rest were stabilized, documented, and transferred to a secondary medical facility that had been prepared and waiting. Nobody died. She didn't realize she'd been carrying that particular fear until the last civilian was loaded and the number held at 0 and something in her chest released that she hadn't known was braced. Weller looked at her across the now quiet staging area and said, with the understatement of someone who expressed things in fractions, "That was a good setup." "The estimates were off," she said. The estimates are always off." He started breaking down his station with the efficient, practiced movements of someone who had done this 100 times. The setup was good anyway. She accepted that. Simultaneously, she learned this in the debrief, having had no real-time visibility into it from the staging area. Federal agents had executed the arrest warrant at Pemberton General Medical Center at the same 0500 timestamp. Raymond Ashford, whose real name the federal filing listed as Marcus Vale, had been in his office. On a Thursday morning at 5 a.m., in his office, which was the behavior of someone who either had information about the operation's timing or had developed the habit, in a long career of operating outside normal parameters, of working when other people slept. He did not resist arrest. He said nothing. Not to the agents, not to the administrator who had been called in and was standing in the corridor in a state of visible shock, not to anyone. He was walked out of Pemberton General Medical Center in handcuffs at 5:17 a.m., past the nursing station on the administrative floor, past the elevator bank, through the lobby with its early morning skeleton crew of security and housekeeping staff, and into a federal vehicle. The administrator, a man named Douglas Farrell, who had hired Vail 14 months ago on a credential package that had passed 3 levels of background check because it had been constructed by people who did that work professionally, stood in the lobby for a long time after the vehicle left. He was still standing there when the second team of agents arrived with a warrant for the institution's records. That part she heard about from Farrow, who called her 6 hours after the operation concluded, when she was sitting in the debrief room at the Asheville facility, drinking her 3rd coffee of the morning and filling out paperwork that needed to be filled out regardless of how the previous 4 hours had gone. "Both subjects in custody," he said. "Vail is already asking to talk. His attorney is trying to stop him, and he's not listening to his attorney, which tells you something about how he's calculating his options. What does he want? Reduced exposure in exchange for full disclosure of the network structure. He's claiming there are 4 other nodes we haven't identified." A pause. "The prosecutor's office is going to want your testimony sooner than 18 days, possibly within the week. Vail's cooperation changes the timeline." "I'll be there," she said. "I know." Another pause, longer. "Nora, what you put together in the last 48 hours, the identification, the network connection, the medical documentation, it didn't just close my case. It restructured it. The prosecutor told me this morning that without the network connection you made at 6 in the morning on a secure terminal running on 4 hours of sleep, Vail would have been an unconnected loose end that we might have found in 18 months, or might have never found. She didn't say anything to that. "I'm just telling you," he said. "I heard you," she said. "Thank you." The formal proceedings around Callum Draper's case resolved over the following weeks in stages, the way federal cases do. Not in a single dramatic moment, but in a sequence of documented steps that collectively amounted to a complete and public dismantling. His attorney filed for dismissal on procedural grounds. The motion was denied. The financial evidence, the text thread with the contact listed as R, now identified as Vail, and Sandra Keogh's testimony about the 6:15 a.m. conversation combined to establish a pattern that the prosecution characterized in its filing as deliberate, coordinated misuse of institutional authority to obstruct federal investigation and suppress a material witness. The medical board was notified. They opened their own parallel proceeding. His surgical privileges at Hartwell Regional were suspended the same afternoon the federal indictment was filed, and the hospital's board of directors issued a public statement that described the situation with the careful, lawyered language of an institution managing liability while trying to say something true at the same time. Buried in the 3rd paragraph of that statement was an acknowledgement that the administrative actions taken against nursing staff on the day of the incident were being reviewed, and that preliminary findings indicated those actions had not followed proper procedure. Sandra Keogh called Nora the day the statement was released. The call lasted 6 minutes. Sandra said what she needed to say, and Nora listened and said what was true, which was that she understood how institutional pressure worked, and that she didn't hold Sandra personally responsible for a system that made certain choices feel like the only choices available. She meant it, mostly. The mostly was the honest part. The formal clearing of her record happened quietly. A letter from the hospital's legal office, a notation in the HR file, the suspension and complaint removed as if they had never been entered. No ceremony, no announcement, just the administrative machinery running in reverse, undoing in 20 minutes what it had done in 20 minutes, 3 weeks earlier. That was how it worked. She'd known that going in. What she hadn't expected, or had expected but hadn't let herself think about, was Patrice. Patrice called her on a Tuesday evening, 3 weeks after the lobby, 4 days after the formal record clearing, from what sounded like her car in the hospital parking structure. "I've been waiting," Patrice said, "for someone to tell me I could call you." "Nobody was stopping you." "I didn't know that." A pause. "Are you okay?" Nora thought about that. She was in her apartment, the East Side apartment she hadn't been back to since the morning of the OR incident, which she'd returned to the previous week to discover that everything was exactly as she'd left it, and that the plant on the kitchen windowsill had not, as she'd feared, died in her absence. "I'm getting there," she said. "I gave my statement," Patrice said, "to the investigators, about the retractor, about the circulating notes, about what I saw." "I know. Thank you. I should have said something that morning, before you walked out. I should have gone to the board myself, or Patrice." She said her name the way she'd once said Sandra's name, with enough weight to slow the sentence down. "You documented what you saw. You kept the notes. You told the truth when it mattered." She paused. "That's the job." A long silence. "Where are you going?" Patrice asked, after all of this. It was a question Nora had been sitting with for 3 weeks, turning it over in different lights to see what it looked like from different angles. She had Alcott's standing offer, a formal return, a role that came with a title and a structure and the particular weight of belonging to something larger than yourself. She had Farrow's federal case, which needed her for testimony and possibly for consultation on the medical documentation aspects of whatever Vale's cooperation opened up. She had the apartment with the surviving plant and the East Side parking structure and 14 months of institutional knowledge about a hospital that was currently rebuilding its surgical department from a compromised foundation. She had a lot of things. None of them were simple. "I don't know yet," she said. "I know what I'm doing next week. I don't know about after that." "That's honest," Patrice said. "It's the best I've got." They talked for another 10 minutes about nothing important, about a difficult case that had come through OR3 the week before, about a resident who had impressed the whole team, about the coffee machine on the 3rd floor that had finally been replaced after 3 years of producing something that tasted like hot water filtered through a bad decision. Small things. The texture of a life that kept moving regardless of what happened in the extraordinary parts of it. After she hung up, Nora sat in the apartment for a while with the lights off and the window open and the particular night sounds of the east side of a mid-sized city coming in with the October air. She thought about the morning in the lobby, the cardboard box, the badge she'd handed to Terrence at the security desk. She thought about walking through the atrium with the water feature running and the noise of people having the worst days of their lives and not letting any of it touch her face. She thought about what it had cost to maintain that, not just that morning, but every morning for 14 months. The specific daily expenditure of being a person who was substantially more than what her name badge said and could not, for reasons that had seemed important and still did, let anyone see it. She had not been pretending to be a good nurse. She had been a good nurse. That was real, and it remained real regardless of what else was also true about her. And she was going to hold on to that distinction because it mattered to her in a way that was harder to explain than she wanted it to be. The morning that Callum Draper had stood in Sandra's office and said she needs to be gone before he makes contact, he had been trying to remove a piece from a board. He hadn't been able to see the piece clearly, hadn't known its weight or its range or what it could do when moved correctly, because he'd looked at her and seen only what she'd allowed him to see. A scrub nurse, a name badge, a problem to be managed. That was his failure. Not arrogance, exactly. Something more specific than arrogance. The failure of imagination that comes from never having been seriously underestimated yourself. The inability to account for the possibility that the person in front of you might be, in the truest sense, more than you are capable of seeing. She had spent 14 months allowing people to see less than was there because it was safer. Because the version of her life that didn't require explanation was easier to maintain than the version that did. But there was a cost to that, one she'd been paying in small installments without fully accounting for it. The cost of living at partial capacity. The cost of the 14 months of quiet that had been, as she'd told Alcott, a pause that had lasted as long as it was going to last, regardless of her choices. She didn't think the answer was simple visibility. She didn't think the answer was to walk into every room announcing the things she'd done and the places she'd been. That wasn't who she was, and it wasn't what any of it had been for. But she thought there was something between hiding and performing, a version of herself that didn't require the daily maintenance of being less than she was, a way of existing in a building, in a city, in a job that didn't depend on everyone in the room being unable to see what was actually in front of them. She was going to have to figure out what that looked like in practice. She didn't know yet. She She was honest enough with herself to know that not knowing yet was not the same as failing to find it. Her phone buzzed. A message from Alcott's aide, not Alcott directly, which meant it was logistical rather than personal. General Alcott's office has forwarded a formal commendation to the federal prosecutor's record regarding your contribution to both operations. He asks that you consider his standing offer when you're ready. No timeline required. She read it twice. Then she set the phone face down on the table and looked at the open window for a while. No timeline required. That was Alcott's version of patience, and from him it was genuine. She knew him well enough to know that. He would wait. The offer was real, and it would remain real, and when she was ready, it would be there. She wasn't ready yet. She picked up the phone and typed back, "Tell him thank you. I'll be in touch." Then she put the phone down again and went to the kitchen and made tea, which she preferred to coffee at this hour and had stopped bothering to justify to anyone, and she stood at the kitchen window with the cup in both hands and looked at the city going about its ordinary night business below her. Somewhere in Raleigh, Marcus Vail was in a federal holding facility cooperating with a prosecution that was going to run for 2 years minimum and reshape what two agencies understood about how private intelligence networks survived the nominal disbanding of the organizations that built them. Somewhere in Charlotte, Callum Draper was meeting with attorneys and waiting for a medical board proceeding that was going to take his surgical privileges in a direction that could not be reversed by reputation or by the particular confidence of a man who had been told he was exceptional for so long that he'd stopped being able to hear anything else. Somewhere in a CVICU, Harold Foss was probably sleeping, his aorta repaired, his body doing what bodies do when given the chance. The slow, unglamorous work of healing. The world was very large and mostly indifferent and kept moving regardless of what any individual person inside it did or didn't do. And yet, the morning it had mattered, the morning when moving or not moving had consequences that extended past her own situation into a structure that affected people she would never meet. She had moved. Not perfectly. Not without fear or calculation or the particular human messiness of making decisions based on incomplete information and imperfect judgment and a phone call at 3 a.m. on a mountain road. But she had moved. She had learned, across years and places and situations she didn't talk about, that the people who act when it matters are almost never the ones who had the most certainty going in. They are almost always the ones who had the most doubt and moved anyway, because they understood something fundamental about what it costs to stay still. She understood that. She had always understood that. The plant on the windowsill had survived 3 weeks without water, which seemed like more than it deserved, and she watered it now with the cup she'd been about to fill for tea. And then she made fresh tea and stood at the window until the city went quiet and the sky above the buildings shifted from black to the particular blue-gray of an hour before dawn. She had decisions to make. She would make them. Not tonight. Tonight she would stand at the window and let the city be what it was, and let herself be what she was inside it, complicated, tired, clear-eyed, and still here. Specifically, pointedly, deliberately still here. That was enough for tonight. Tomorrow was for everything else.